Somewhere in your genome, if your ancestors came from outside Africa, there is a silence that scientists have been trying to explain for over a decade. Not a gap, no noise. An absence so complete and so specific that it has a name, a desert. And for years, the explanation was simple, tidy, and it turns out almost certainly wrong. What actually caused that silence has just been uncovered from two completely different directions by two completely different research teams working on two completely different continents. One team was reading chromosomes, the other was reading broken bones. And when you put what they found side by side, the picture that emerges is not a footnote about ancient biology. It's a story about who got to survive, who got erased, and why. Most people think they already know the Neanderthal story. Two species meet, interbreed a little, one goes extinct, and the survivors carry a small percentage of ancient DNA as a kind of genetic souvenir, 1 to 4%, scattered through the genome of most people outside sub-Saharan Africa. It's usually treated as a curiosity, a fun fact for a trivia night. What the newest generation of ancient DNA research has actually found underneath that fun fact is considerably less comfortable. Here's where it starts. Scientists studying the modern human genome noticed something strange years ago, stretches of the X chromosome that are almost completely empty of Neanderthal ancestry. Not thin, not reduced, nearly blank. Researchers call these regions Neanderthal deserts, and their existence has been documented since work by Sriram Sankararaman and colleagues back in 2014. The X chromosome, which women carry 2 copies of and men carry 1, turned out to be one of the most Neanderthal DNA-depleted regions in the entire modern human genome. For a long time, the leading explanation fit neatly inside an established evolutionary principle called Haldane's rule. When two closely related populations have been separated long enough to start evolving apart, their hybrid offspring often carry genetic incompatibilities, and those incompatibilities tend to show up disproportionately on the X chromosome. Under this model, Neanderthal genes on the X chromosome would have caused subtle problems in hybrid children, reduced fertility, developmental issues, and natural selection would have quietly scrubbed them out of the population over thousands of generations. It was a clean explanation. It required no speculation about behavior, only biology, and it held up reasonably well for over a decade. Then a team at the University of Pennsylvania Alexander-Platt, Daniel Harris, and Sarah Tishkoff asked a question nobody had pursued with enough rigor before. What if you looked at the exchange from the other direction? Everyone had been studying the Neanderthal DNA that ended up in modern humans. Almost nobody had carefully studied the modern human DNA that ended up in Neanderthals. That reversal changed everything. Published in Science in February 2026, the team's analysis found that Neanderthal X chromosomes carried a striking surplus of modern human DNA, roughly 62% more than would be expected relative to the rest of their genome. Where the modern human X chromosome had a Neanderthal desert, the Neanderthal X chromosome had the mirror image, an unmistakable abundance of human ancestry. That detail alone dismantles the old explanation. If Neanderthal DNA on the X chromosome had simply been biologically harmful, toxic to hybrid offspring, regardless of which parent it came from, you would expect the same pattern in both directions. Neanderthal genomes should have shown the same kind of depletion for human X chromosome DNA that human genomes show for Neanderthal X chromosome DNA. Instead, they showed the opposite. Human DNA wasn't being purged from Neanderthal X chromosomes. It was accumulating there. We found a pattern indicating a sex bias. Gene flow occurred predominantly between Neanderthal males and anatomically modern human females, said Platt, one of the study's co-first authors, describing the pattern that resulted in the near total loss of Neanderthal DNA from human X chromosomes. In other words, the desert wasn't created by bad genes being weeded out. It was created by an asymmetry in who was actually having children with whom. The team tested this rigorously, modeling multiple demographic explanations before settling on mating preference as the best fit. One alternative explanation was migration bias, the idea that mostly female modern humans might have moved into Neanderthal territory, skewing the genetic exchange without any preference being involved at all. But even in the most extreme version of that scenario, migration alone couldn't produce the full effect observed in the data. According to Platt, when the researchers tested other possible causes, mating preferences provided the simplest explanation that accounted for the actual genetic pattern, a persistent, generation-spanning tendency for Neanderthal males to have children with modern human females, rather than with Neanderthal females, fit the evidence more cleanly than any alternative the team could construct. Here is where it's important to slow down, because this is also where a lot of coverage of this research overreaches. The Penn team identified a clear, statistically robust pattern in the DNA. What they did not do, and were explicit about not doing, was determine why that pattern existed, or what it actually looked like on the ground for the people involved. Sarah Tishkoff and her team deliberately avoided speculating about whether the bias reflected mutual attraction, one-sided preference, social structure, or something more coercive. The genetic data can tell you that gene flow was asymmetric. It cannot by itself tell you what any individual encounter between a Neanderthal man and a modern human woman actually looked like, felt like, or meant to the people involved. That distinction matters because it's the difference between a real, fascinating scientific finding and a speculative narrative dressed up as one. What we can say with confidence. Across many generations, in a specific and consistent direction, Neanderthal ancestry entered the human lineage predominantly through Neanderthal fathers rather than Neanderthal mothers. One hypothesis the researchers are now investigating is whether Neanderthal social structure itself explains part of the pattern. Specifically, whether Neanderthal women tended to stay within their birth communities while men moved between groups, a pattern documented in a number of primate and human societies, which would naturally increase the chances of Neanderthal men encountering and mating with women from outside their own group, including modern humans. Tishkoff has described the deeper context this way. Roughly 600,000 years ago, the ancestors of modern humans and Neanderthals diverged into two separate lineages, with modern humans developing in Africa and Neanderthals developing in Eurasia. That separation, she's noted, was far from permanent. Over the following hundreds of thousands of years, modern human populations expanded out of Africa and into territory Neanderthals had occupied for a very long time. Setting up the encounters, this new study is now able to reconstruct with far more precision than before. What the genetic data leaves us with, then, isn't a scandal. It's a genuinely strange and consequential imbalance. Neanderthal women's genetic contribution to the modern human lineage was, for reasons the DNA alone can't fully explain, dramatically smaller than Neanderthal men's. Their X chromosomes, the chromosomes that most directly carry the signature of female ancestry, left almost no trace in the people who came after. The X chromosome study reconstructs mating patterns from statistics buried in the genome. It can't tell you what happened to any specific woman. For that, you have to turn to an entirely separate body of research, one built not on chromosomes, but on broken bones. The Troisième cavern of Goyer in modern-day Belgium has been known to archaeologists since the 19th century. Early excavations pulled more than 100 Neanderthal bone fragments from the site, the largest such assemblage in northern Europe, with clear evidence of intentional modification. For a long time, the fragments were cataloged but not fully understood. The technology to extract detailed biological information from bones that shattered simply didn't exist yet. That changed with a decade-long research effort led by Quentin Cosnefroy, along with Isabelle Crèvecoeur, Hélène Rougier, and a team spanning institutions including the CNRS, the Université de Bordeaux, and colleagues in Germany's Max Planck Network. Published in Scientific Reports in November 2025, their study combined DNA sequencing for genetic sex determination, radiocarbon dating, isotopic analysis to trace where individuals had grown up, and virtual three-dimensional reconstruction of bone fragments too damaged to analyze by hand. What they reconstructed is one of the most detailed forensic profiles ever built for a Neanderthal cannibalism site. The remains represent a minimum of 6 individuals dated to between 41 and 45,000 years ago. Genetic sex determination identified 4 of them as adult or adolescent females, alongside 2 immature individuals. And the females weren't simply female, they were notably short in stature and structurally more graceful than local Neanderthal populations typically were, standing apart from the regional norm in a way that showed up clearly across multiple skeletal measurements. All of the remains carried the same kinds of marks archaeologists find on the bones of hunted game at the same site: cut marks from stone tools, deliberate fracturing, and percussion damage consistent with marrow extraction. This wasn't a burial. It wasn't a ritual with special treatment. The bones were processed the way food is processed. What makes the Goyet findings different from other documented instances of Neanderthal cannibalism across Europe is the isotopic evidence. The chemical signatures locked into these bones, reflecting the water and food sources of wherever these individuals actually grew up, showed that none of them were local to Goyet. They came from somewhere else, somewhere the researchers couldn't precisely pinpoint, but which the isotopic data made clear was a different region entirely. Cosnefroy, describing the composition of the group to Live Science, put it directly: "We cannot determine exactly why these individuals were targeted, but the composition of the assemblage, 4 adult females and 2 immature individuals, is too specific to be accidental." The researchers classify this pattern as selective exocannibalism, the targeted killing and consumption of specific individuals from an outside group, as opposed to random or opportunistic cannibalism within a single community. If this had simply been about hunger, a group under pressure consuming whoever happened to be available, you'd expect the demographic profile of the remains to look random. A mix of ages, a mix of sexes, people who belonged locally alongside people who didn't. Instead, the pattern is precise: small-bodied females, non-local, alongside 2 immature individuals, and apparently no adult males from the local group represented among the dead at all. The researchers propose cautiously that this selection may reflect an attempt to target the more physically vulnerable members of a rival or neighboring group, women and children who would have been harder to defend and easier to overpower than adult males. They also raise a further, more specific hypothesis that targeting women and children from a competing group specifically may have served a strategic function beyond simple food acquisition, undermining that group's ability to reproduce and sustain itself, a form of demographic warfare that has documented parallels in more recent human conflicts. The timing situates all of this inside one of the most turbulent windows in the entire span of Neanderthal existence. Between 41 and 45,000 years ago, the climate across late Pleistocene Europe was swinging unpredictably between warming and cooling phases, putting severe pressure on the large mammal populations Neanderthal groups depended on. At the same time, modern humans were beginning to establish a presence in the same broader region. Genetic evidence places Homo sapiens roughly 600 kilometers away at Ranus in modern Germany during approximately the same period. Neanderthal populations, already thinly distributed and increasingly isolated from each other, were being squeezed from multiple directions at once: shrinking prey, a changing climate, and an expanding, unfamiliar competitor moving into their territory. Into that pressure, the Goyet. Evidence suggests at least some Neanderthal groups turned on each other, hunting down the more vulnerable members of neighboring communities rather than finding ways to integrate or coexist with them. It's worth being precise about what connects these two pieces of research because they come from entirely separate teams, entirely separate methods, and entirely separate data sets. The Penn geneticists reconstructed a demographic pattern from statistical signals buried in modern and ancient genomes. The Goyet researchers reconstructed a specific localized event from physical bone evidence in a single Belgian cave. Neither study makes claims about the other. What connects them is context, not shared authorship or shared data. Both point toward the same general period, the final tens of thousands of years of Neanderthal existence, and both describe, from completely different angles, a world in which Neanderthal women's presence in the historical and genetic record was being diminished. In the genetic story, Neanderthal women's DNA is nearly absent from the modern human lineage, for reasons the data alone can't fully explain. In the archaeological story, specific Neanderthal women, small-statured, from outside the local community, were hunted, killed, and consumed alongside two children, in a targeted, non-random pattern that researchers describe as too specific to be accidental. Taken together, without overstating what either study proves on its own, they sketch a picture of the final chapter of Neanderthal existence as considerably harder and considerably more violent, for women specifically, than the popular image of two ancient peoples quietly exchanging genes on a hillside. There's one more genetic thread worth pulling into this picture from separate research on the Neanderthal Y chromosome, the chromosome passed exclusively from father to son. Multiple ancient Neanderthal genomes studied over the past several years show that their Y chromosomes had, at some point well before the species went extinct, already been replaced by a Y chromosome lineage derived from modern humans. In genetic terms, Neanderthal fathers, across generations, persisted. Their male line continued to be represented even inside populations that identified as Neanderthal right up until the end. Neanderthal mothers did not fare the same way. The X chromosome, the clearest genetic signature of female ancestry passed down through generations, became, in the human lineage, a near-total desert. Fathers who stayed, mothers who were erased. That asymmetry, sitting quietly in the chromosomes of billions of people alive today, is the genetic fingerprint of something that took tens of thousands of years to fully play out, and that ancient DNA researchers have only been able to reconstruct with real precision in the last few years, using tools that simply didn't exist a decade ago. It's also worth being fair to the other half of this story, because the children who resulted from these encounters between Neanderthal fathers and modern human mothers weren't simply passive carriers of a grim demographic statistic. Some of what they inherited turned out to be genuinely useful. Immune system variants that may have helped early modern human populations adapt to pathogens already present in Eurasia. Variations in circadian rhythm genes suited to the light cycles of northern latitudes are very different from the ones their African ancestors evolved under. In some populations, Neanderthal-derived genes affecting skin and hair pigmentation and pain sensitivity appear to have provided real adaptive value in a new environment. But the inheritance wasn't uniformly beneficial. Research over the past decade has also linked specific Neanderthal-derived variants to increased risk for conditions including depression, blood clotting disorders, and altered inflammatory responses in some modern populations. None of this reflects some kind of design or intention. It's the ordinary, unglamorous outcome of two genomes that had spent roughly 600,000 years diverging from each other, being forced back together by circumstance, producing a mixed legacy of costs and benefits that modern humans still carry, largely without knowing it. Put all of it together, and here's where the science actually stands, without inflating it past what the data supports. A rigorous 2026 genetic study demonstrates, about as clearly as population genetics can demonstrate anything, that interbreeding between Neanderthals and modern humans was strongly and consistently sex-biased, in a way that best fits a pattern of mating preference rather than simple migration or genetic incompatibility, while explicitly declining to speculate about the nature or circumstances of that preference. A separate, equally rigorous 2025 archaeological study demonstrates that at least one Neanderthal community engaged in the targeted killing and consumption of women and children from a rival or neighboring group, in a pattern the researchers themselves describe as too specific to be random. Both studies describe the same broad window of Neanderthal history, a species under mounting environmental and demographic pressure, encountering an expanding competitor in its final tens of thousands of years. Neither study on its own proves that Neanderthal women were broadly subjected to sexual coercion, or that the Goyet cannibalism was representative of Neanderthal life, generally rather than a specific localized event during a specific crisis. The honest state of the science is that we have two separate, real, and genuinely striking findings, occupying the same historical window, both of which point toward Neanderthal women's lives and legacies being diminished through mechanisms that remain, in real and important ways, still not fully understood. What we do know with more confidence than we've ever had before is this: the DNA carried by billions of people alive today holds a silence where an entire dimension of Neanderthal ancestry should be. And for the first time, thanks to tools that only became available in the past few years, genome sequencing sensitive enough to detect a 62% skew in ancient chromosomes, isotopic analysis precise enough to trace where a 45,000-year-old woman grew up, three-dimensional reconstruction capable of rebuilding a body from fragments smaller than a coin. We're finally able to ask, with real evidence behind the question, what filled that silence in the first place? The Neanderthal genome is still being read, one fragment, one chromosome, one cave at a time, and what keeps surfacing, piece by piece, is a version of the ending of that species that is far less peaceful and far more human in its complexity and its cruelty than the story most of us grew up hearing.